Thank you.
Well, good morning. It's really wonderful to be in this really august institution. I always feel whenever I drive into places like this that I'm in the wrong place, because I'm a boy from the back streets of Lambeth, and I think somehow I've landed on the wrong planet. But I know with Julian, I'm the sort of the Muslim long stop always. When he can't get a speaker, then he comes to me. So you'll see. Well, I'm agreeing very much with Richard, but I'm coming very much from the Islamic perspective, and I wanted to try and do it from that because I'm very conscious of the nature of the audience and some of the key things. I'm also very conscious that I'm surrounded by huge Islamic scholars, so if I get things wrong, then I know you'll correct me in the correct Islamic way by just yelling rubbish. Totally not. The little cartoons are drawn from 1,001 inventions, by the way, Muslim heritage in our world. Okay, what am I going to do? It's not very ambitious. In my 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about the context of Muslim faith schools. I'm going to explain the meaning of life from a Muslim point of view. I've got 20 minutes is enough on this to explain the meaning of life. It's not problematic. I'm going to talk about the nature of parental duty from an Islamic perspective, and then, again, I'm going to raise some of the more contentious issues from facing Islamic schools. And then I'm going to justify faith schools from an Islamic perspective. I think I only said at the outset that there is a view, there's a whole group of secular Muslims who think faith schools are completely wrong. And it's a shame they couldn't be here, because I'm interested to hear what they say. Okay. Do you remember this chap? Isn't it funny, that Richard here actually mentions John Patton? John Patton was Minister of Education for 2 years. I was, at that stage, I was a senior advisor inspector in Birmingham, which was a Brighouse's world. And John Patton actually once quite famously described Brighouse as a madman and a nutter who went around frightening children, which was quite wonderful. It was very good of Patton because he finished up, or Mrs. Patton, who was quite wealthy, finished up paying an enormous out-of-court settlement to Brighouse for libel. And we financed one of our best African Caribbean mentoring schemes from that, so I was always very thankful for him. He was a strange man, if I can be too rude about him. He was a very strong Catholic, a very strong tradition. But I think he rather lost the plot. And he said things, I believe in God, I worry about him, I think that he probably worries about me. It's very kind of him to think about God worrying about him. But I was one of the few people, interestingly, who understood why he was so much in favour of faith schools. Because that was his particular background. He had a particular view, which I didn't share, about frightening children into the whole notion of sin and evil and hell, and that was part of why. But at that particular stage, I was senior inspector for secondary school. And I've been, I don't know how many thousands of schools I've been in classrooms and so on and so forth in my 18 years in the city. But I did a lot of work with our Catholic partnership. And I did a lot of work in the Catholic schools, especially secondary schools. And to my absolute surprise, I really loved it. Because when I went into the schools, there was a different tone, there was a different emphasis, there was a different feeling about many of the schools. And also working with the principals and the heads and so on, I also loved their humour. It was second to none. There was only one Catholic sister who ran the best school in the city, who used to give as good as she got with a lot of the male heads. So I've got an understanding, I've been in lots and lots of schools. Within Birmingham, when I first arrived in '82, I was school inspector for a region which had lots of Catholic schools, of which there were almost no Catholics in Ward End. And so I became very involved in the politics of all that. So dear old John Patton, he's never left me, as dear old John. It's in terms of what we've got in terms of Islamic schools. There are a number of different types, and I thought I'd just briefly mention them. We have the Darul Ulooms, they're called, which actually, I notice a difference. They teach Islamic subjects. They're about producing scholars, imams, and so on and so forth. And so their emphasis is very much upon the Islamic subjects and the national curriculum. Right? But then you've got a lot more others, about 130 independent faith schools, Muslim schools. And they teach the national curriculum and Islamic subjects. Right? So it's a different emphasis, really. And funny enough, I had a super Friday a couple of weeks ago. I went up to Stockport to deliver the prizes to a wonderful school called KD Grammar, which has got some of the best results in the country. Boys' school. and they were talking about this very thing, about being high in attainment, but they were a bit concerned about the whole Islamic perspective of the school, interestingly enough. We've got lots and lots of schools up and down the country, many of them do very well. We then got a series of madrasas, and if you don't go to the independent faith school or Darul Uloom, then most Muslim parents send their children to madrasas, which means school, and they tend to be after school or weekend. They're part-time, and there are some 4,000 plus of them. And then we've got, within our maintained sector, Richard, and I'm delighted that you made that distinction, because Mr. Gove frightens me half to death, that we finish up with, there are about 400 schools in the country who aren't faith, but have got by far a large majority of Muslims. And often when I say large, it's like 100%, so that's a different perspective. So, from an Islamic perspective, I want to discuss 3 or 4 key concepts, because I think it's those concepts which underpin the choices and the dilemmas that many Muslim parents have to face up and down the country. Because nobody's done any research, but we're pretty certain that given the opportunity, the majority of Muslim parents would send their children to a type of Muslim school, given the opportunity. But they're simply not there. There's simply not enough of them, because the Muslim population, young people, continues to rise and rise and rise, and it tends to be one of the poorest populations anyway, so they can't afford the fees and what have you. So, and this is my meaning of life from a Muslim perspective, really. But if you look at the theology, when you go through the Quran, and it's a particular phrase I like, it talks about attaining to faith and do good works. Attaining to faith and do good works. And they're the 2 great imperatives on all Muslims throughout the Muslim world, regardless of which particular sectarian background one comes from. And it comes time and time again in the Quran about attaining to faith and do good works. And it's the attaining to faith is one particular aspect, and you've got, as you all know, your 5 pillars and so on and so forth. But it's the do good works thing, which I think is really, really crucial. It's one reason that I became attracted to Islam, I think, about the doing of good works. There is also in Islam the concept of taqwa, which means God consciousness. And I don't have any arrogance, so to speak, I'm very sorry to say, because my whole tradition and background has not been within the Muslim world. I'm only a boy, I'm only about 10 years old as a Muslim. But because I've done so much writing in relation to education and Islam, I've looked at the concept of taqwa a lot. And there's not really an English equivalent, is there? Because being God conscious, it's very difficult to render. It is about conscience, it's also about working for God, it's about everything you do in life should remember God in one form or another. It's about the remembrance of God. And it's a key concept for Muslims in terms of God consciousness, in terms of taqwa. Indeed, one of the many quotes I could have put forward is sort of 39:13. The most honourable among you in the sight of God, who is the one who is most God conscious. But it's not quietistic. You don't actually withdraw from the world. You have to live within the world with all its challenges and all the tests and so on and so forth. It's a very human religion in that particular sense. But the key is to try and remember God at all times. Very, very difficult in this is very much a secular and an aggressively secular religion. There are a couple of other key concepts I want to mention as well. One is amana. Amana is trust. It's the trust, it's like the covenant you have with God, and God actually entrusts you as a parent to try and bring your children up as Muslims in society, any society in which you live. So it's the whole notion of trust. There's also the notion, which I'm particularly fond of Khalifa. And that it's translated as vice-regent, God's deputy. And again, we don't really have a term in English, but it covers it. And essentially, the view is that all Muslims on earth are actually the vice-regents of God, as the sons and daughters of Adam are the vice-regents of God. And that should inform all the things that one does. So being a Khalifa is really, really important concept. And it is a particularly for parents, of course, because that is the greatest thing that you actually ever do in your life, really, in terms of having children and looking after them and trying to bring them up as good. There's also the notion of fitra. And this again, when I was travelling, I did Umrah, which is a small pilgrimage in Mecca some years ago. And it's the first time I really came across the concept, because I don't know whether you know the term, but Muslims talk about reversion, not about conversion. And I remember I was dressed in white cloth, and as I got off the bus, and there were these really quite fierce-looking young men standing at the roadside, and they came up and they said, "Hello, great, you're a Muslim, Salam alaikum." Because they're all northern, I wasn't actually expecting that. And they said, "Oh, you're what we call a revert, you are, lad." And I said, "Well, would you be so kind as to explain?" They said, well, basically, every human being is born worshipping God, right? And I said, and I went with that because my own experience as a child was that I was a very, very strong Christian child. And I had a very strong, as children do, a very strong sense of God. And he said, what happens, therefore, is that for Muslims it's quite straightforward because you're born into it, but if you're not a Muslim and you come back, then you revert to what you were as a child, hence. And fitra is that we're all born worshipping God, so that's a very, very strong sense. So there, if you like, it's the theological side, it's taqwa, and in particular it's being a khalifa, being a vice ruler. There's a number of educational principles that also underpin it. Tabir is and again, there's not an exact English equivalent, because in the Islamic system, there is no divorce between secular and religious. It's all one, it's tabir, it's all together. And tabir is about spiritual and moral education. And interestingly, when I was doing the KD thing the other day, the head of a very, very successful school, wonderful school in Manchester, was saying that he wanted to concentrate much more on tabir, because he felt that yes, they got the attainment right, but he wasn't certain they got the balance of Islam right. There's a notion about that, but that means it means manners, it means good manners, it means how to behave. There's also a whole notion of a spiritual adab as well as how you behave before God. Akhlaq, it actually is excellence. And one of the things, and it's very Greek in that sense, about when one should strive for an education, is the notion of excellence. And then there's a whole thing about ilm, which is knowledge. And knowledge, again, it's not time to talk about any depth, but it's about there's revealed knowledge and there's acquired knowledge and self-knowledge. And one of the greatest things, and the Prophet was very fond of one of his greatest prayers, "O Lord, increase me in my knowledge." And the other aspect is, and this comes from my whole background in terms of being director of the Islam and Citizen Education Project, that it's very strong on citizenship, and the whole view in Islam is that to be a good Muslim, to be a good citizen, you have to be a good Muslim. The two are totally compatible. So they're the underpinning concepts. The ultimate goal is to seek God through knowledge. Okay? So parents, therefore, they have a number of duties. They've got to ensure that the child is brought up to understand these concepts, to remember God and fulfill their responsibilities as intelligence. And that's a difficult task, and worries a lot of ordinary, inverted commas, Muslim parents and almost about how you keep your children away from such negative and secular and sexual influences. You've got to also ensure that faith is the key determinant in the life of your child. Again, if you're in a secular school, and with Christian Muslim Forum during my conference on belief and being, which is for teachers of faith in schools which are secular. And when we ran the first one, hopefully the second one in February, quite interestingly, one of my group were actually saying that this is the default position is secularism, and that's a big worry for many Muslim parents. And then you've got to get the best education for your child to fulfill all those duties. It's not, and again I'm repeating something of Richard, it's not straightforward because it's not my faith school right or wrong, because if we did that then I think it's the way to hell, I think, really. Many of our Muslim schools attain very highly and they achieve very highly. And there's a distinction for me, because attainment is about what is measured and achievement very often is about what is not measured. And we've got some of the best results in the country. I'm doing some work fascinating, the first time in my life. You may have seen, and I hate the Channel 4 dispatches program, I think it's so tendentious, but the dispatches about extremism, extremist views in one of the schools in Birmingham, which is my home city, on the Darul Ulooms, and I'm working with them now because the previous head, whom I knew well and liked enormously, had some very extreme views about keeping his children away from the evil non-believers, the Kafirs. So it's partly about the views and how the Muslims are prepared for the world in which they live, as opposed to a world that doesn't really exist. It is about the real world. It is about citizenship. There are issues about the quality of teaching as well, which are quite fundamental. And very often, with some of the schools, if you actually criticise the teaching, they get very, very sensitive, because they think you're criticising the teachings. And there's a lot of sensitivity in that particular, especially in the Darul Ulooms, because some of the teaching methods are not necessarily of the 21st century. The tradition that we've got within Islam, which I think sometimes gets completely overlooked and forgotten, is that it's authoritative, but it's not authoritarian. And that's a key distinction, I think. So for parents, they've got to bear in mind all these things when they move into taking decisions about their children's future and what they're going to do and so on and so forth. It's an onerous responsibility. And if you look at the history of migration and the number of Muslims we've got and where they come from and their particular backgrounds and the socioeconomic problems they've got and the health problems they've got and so on and so forth, it really is quite awesome for the average parent. And many of them, if they can, and this is one of the big issues, will just say, well, if I can find a nice Muslim school, that will fulfill my religious duties. I would argue that's actually far too narrow, because it's actually got to be a Muslim school that actually teaches all the things we've gone into. So many Muslims support faith schools because they actually believe they're fulfilling their religious duties, and that's absolutely fundamental, I think. Not as a relegation of their own individual responsibilities, but as a conscious decision to say, well, actually, I want it. When I get, and I've been in quite a few of the Muslim schools, they're a bit like the Catholic ones. There is a different ethos, there is a different atmosphere, and also the class sizes are generally speaking much smaller, and that does help with issues of autonomy. If you look at many of the schools, yes, they do very well, but it is the business about becoming good citizens. Because one of my criticisms, and one reason I've done so much work with madrasas on the ICE project and other things, is actually that for many of our Muslim parents who come from the subcontinent, they're still looking backwards. They're looking at a world that actually doesn't exist, to be honest. And this is where I think I understood the head of the Birmingham Darul, because what he was trying to do was to put his hand around the people's, and he was saying things like, well, you mustn't mix with non-believers, you mustn't mix with others. And they're all pretty evil, and then there's a whole issues about the sizes of beard and all sorts of things, which actually are really rather silly. And he wasn't a silly man, and far from it, because he actually, the school was teaching citizenship using materials that my team had produced for them. So it's very much about saying, I'm going to make a choice, I want my children to understand the key concepts of Islam, I want them to behave with taqwa, and so on and so forth. They believe, many of them, that if you go to the faith schools, it can help, and I've used the term inoculate their children from some of the worst excesses of the secular and sexual world. Right? And that's important because, and I say this to my work with Muslim parents, and I say, the secularism and sexuality is around us. You can't keep your children in a box. You've got to actually make sure that their faith is strong enough in order for them to say, well, actually, this is not the road I want to take with. They believe, rightly I believe, that a religious foundation will help them attain to faith and do good works. And I just wanted to finish with one of my sort of favourite quotes about it. Because I sort of started with the notion of God consciousness with taqwa. And the last sermon on Arafat that the Prophet gave, he actually, I've just taken one section from, he said, "People, verily your Lord and Sustainer is one, and your ancestor is one. All of you descend from Adam, and Adam was made of earth. There is no superiority for an Arab over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab over an Arab. Neither a white man over a black man, nor a black man over a white man, except the superiority gained through God consciousness. Indeed, the noblest of you is the one who is most deeply conscious of God. And I believe that many Muslim parents send their children to faith schools because it is about being deeply conscious of God, and I would defend people's right so to do. Thank you.